The year was deep in the turmoil of the Second World War, and the Atlantic Ocean had become a bridge that carried not only soldiers and supplies, but also prisoners. From ports on the East Coast, trains pushed steadily westward, carrying men who had once marched under the banner of the Third Reich. They were German soldiers, captured on distant battlefields, now destined for an entirely different kind of war experience. As the cars rattled through rolling farmland and small towns, many of the prisoners peered through the narrow windows, expecting to see the kind of rigid order and armed vigilance they knew so well. Instead, they saw something unfamiliar, something that unsettled them even before they arrived at their camps. The streets seemed calm, the people moved freely, and the world outside their windows appeared untouched by the shadows of war. For these men, trained to obey commands and accustomed to the presence of authority at every corner, the openness of America was both foreign and disorienting. Imagine the shock of stepping off a train in a rural town and hearing laughter drifting from a cafe, or seeing children walking to school without fear of patrols. There were no uniformed police directing citizens at every crossing, no officials demanding to see identification papers. In Germany, such freedom would have seemed reckless, a sign of disorder waiting to be crushed. Yet here, it was simply the way of life, and the prisoners could not ignore how smoothly it seemed to function. Their first impression of America was not of overwhelming military power, but of everyday liberty. Inside the camps, the men expected harsh conditions. Rumors had told them to brace for punishment, isolation, and hunger. What they found was different. Barbed wire marked the perimeter, and guards stood watch. But within those boundaries, the routine was far more humane than they imagined. They were fed, given space to live, and allowed to work. Beyond the fences, the faint hum of American life continued without interruption. The distant sound of trains, church bells on Sunday, or the low murmur of evening conversations reminded them that life in these towns was steady and unbroken. For the prisoners, that normal rhythm became as striking as any military encounter. Each day brought small revelations. A prisoner sent to work on a farm might feel the warmth of the sun on his back, while noticing the trust placed in him by his American overseer. Another might glance at a shop window during transport and see customers entering and leaving without showing proof of who they were. These moments, so ordinary for the locals, struck the prisoners with extraordinary force. The world beyond the barbed wire was a living classroom, teaching lessons about liberty in ways no textbook or speech could. America revealed itself not through slogans or commands, but through the daily lives of its citizens. The contrast with their past followed them like a shadow. In Germany, even the smallest town carried the heavy hand of the state. Posters shouted orders, police maintained constant watch, and whispers of disloyalty could end a life. To arrive in an American town and see neighbors exchanging greetings in the open air, to witness a shopkeeper trusting a child with change, was to confront a reality that defied everything they had been taught. It was as though the bars of the prison camp contained not only the Germans but also their old assumptions. Outside those fences, freedom was on display, visible and undeniable. For many of the prisoners, this early context set the tone for their entire captivity. They were still soldiers in enemy hands, yet the enemy appeared less hostile than expected. Instead of intimidation, they encountered a society that treated freedom as natural and unremarkable. This quiet revelation carried more weight than any show of force. The prisoners began to realize that America's strength was not only measured in weapons or armies, but in the way its citizens lived their lives. The small towns that welcomed them, often without chains or suspicion, became their first glimpse into a different kind of power. This was the beginning of a story that would stay with them long after the war ended. The first impression of American liberty did not fade, but grew sharper with time. In that early context, in the calm rhythm of small towns and the quiet humanity of daily life, the seeds were planted. Seeds of doubt about the system they had once served, and seeds of recognition that there was another way for a nation to exist. For German prisoners arriving in the United States, the most shocking discovery was not their captivity, but the freedom they witnessed all around them. The longer the prisoners remained in the United States, the sharper the contrast became. Each morning they awoke to the sound of camp life, structured but not brutal, and each day they glimpsed the world beyond the fences. That world unsettled them, for it clashed violently with what they had been taught to believe. In Germany, life was defined by control. Every action was watched, every word measured, and every moment framed by the fear of punishment. Here in America, people seemed to live without such chains, yet the nation was strong enough to fight a global war and hold thousands of enemies within its borders. The contradiction left the prisoners struggling to understand how this was possible. Imagine standing in a town square in Germany before the war. Posters of the regime towered over the streets, uniforms marched in precise formations, and loudspeakers echoed with commands. Citizens lowered their eyes, careful to avoid suspicion. Now imagine the same man, years later, gazing through the back of a transport truck at an American town. He saw shopkeepers smiling at their customers, men tipping their hats to neighbors, and young people walking freely with no one stopping them. The comparison was not subtle. It was blinding. For the prisoners, this was not simply a different country. It was a different way of living. The conflict was not only external, but internal. The men wrestled with questions that could not easily be voiced. How could a country thrive without constant surveillance? How could order exist without a rigid display of authority? They had been raised to believe that strength required control, and that without control, chaos would follow. Yet every day in America challenged that belief. The streets were orderly, the farms productive, the factories efficient, and all of it existed without the visible chains of power they thought were necessary. The shock of this realization unsettled their certainty more deeply than captivity itself. Some reacted with denial. They told themselves it was an illusion, a trick carefully staged to weaken their resolve. They insisted that true discipline existed only in Germany, and that what they saw here was weakness disguised as kindness. Others, however, began to question. When they worked alongside American civilians, they noticed the confidence of those around them. When they watched guards who carried themselves with calm authority rather than menace, they recognized a different kind of discipline. It was not born of fear but of mutual trust, and slowly that trust began to gnaw at the foundations of what they had believed. The contrast grew sharper the longer they stayed. Letters from home, censored and delayed, reminded them of the harshness they had left behind. Stories of shortages, suspicion, and constant watchfulness stood in stark relief against the freedom of American towns. Even as prisoners, they sensed they were living in a place where liberty thrived more fully than in their homeland. It was an irony they could not escape. Inside the fences, they were captives, yet outside those same fences, citizens walked more freely than they themselves ever had in Germany. This conflict between expectation and reality defined much of their captivity. They had been taught that freedom was weakness, yet here freedom produced strength. They had believed that strict control created order, yet here order flourished without it. Each contradiction struck like a hammer against the iron walls of ideology they carried within them. For some, those walls began to crack. For others, they remained, but the memory of the contrast would never fade. In the quiet tension of this discovery, the prisoners learned that the most powerful enemy they faced was not the nation across the ocean, but the truth that stared at them in the open streets of America. To understand why these German prisoners found themselves in small American towns, we must look at the larger currents of the war. By 1943, the United States was deeply committed to the global struggle, fighting across North Africa, the Atlantic, and eventually the heart of Europe. Victories on distant battlefields brought with them an inevitable burden, thousands of captured enemy soldiers who needed to be housed and managed. The solution was both practical and symbolic. Rather than keep them in Europe, many were transported across the ocean to American soil. Camps were built in quiet rural areas, often far from major cities, where land was plentiful and communities could make use of the labor the prisoners could provide. The idea was simple, but effective. American farmers and industries faced labor shortages as millions of young men served overseas. German prisoners, guarded but capable, filled that gap. Each day they were sent out to harvest crops, repair roads, or work in factories. The work gave them purpose, but it also brought them into contact with American life. The boundaries of the camp remained clear, yet every task outside those fences offered a glimpse of how this foreign society functioned. By design or by chance, captivity became a window into democracy. The origins of their exposure to American freedom were rooted not in deliberate education, but in necessity. This arrangement contrasted sharply with what the prisoners had known in Germany. In their homeland, labor was dictated by the state and enforced by authority. Here, the work felt different. Though they were still captives, many noticed the absence of constant intimidation. Farmers who supervised them often treated them with a surprising degree of respect. Some even shared meals or spoke with them casually, an act that would have been unthinkable under the rigid discipline of the regime they once served. These encounters revealed a subtle truth. In America, trust and cooperation were woven into daily life, even when dealing with former enemies. The camps themselves reflected this philosophy. They were not luxurious, but they were orderly and humane. Prisoners had access to food, basic medical care, and even recreation. Music drifted from barracks, soccer games filled the afternoons, and work details broke the monotony of confinement. To the Germans, this atmosphere felt disarming. They had been prepared for cruelty, yet what they experienced was fairness. That fairness became one of the most striking elements of their captivity, not because it excused their situation, but because it reflected a national character that valued dignity, even in war. The origins of their shock, then, were not found in grand speeches or political lessons. They were discovered in the quiet rhythm of daily interactions. A farmer handing a prisoner a tool without suspicion. A child walking past the camp fence without fear. A shopkeeper waving to a guard without anxiety. These ordinary moments carried extraordinary meaning for men who had grown up under a system that distrusted its own people. What seemed unremarkable to Americans became profound for the Germans, for it showed that freedom was not a fragile dream, but a living reality. As the months passed, the pattern became clear. The United States had not set out to re-educate these prisoners. It had only sought to house them, feed them, and use their labor. Yet in doing so, it inadvertently exposed them to a different kind of strength, one built not on the presence of chains, but on the absence of them. The background of their captivity was shaped by necessity, but the origins of their transformation lay in what they witnessed. America revealed its values not through force, but through the simple routines of daily life. This unplanned education proved far more powerful than deliberate indoctrination. By being placed in the heart of communities that lived by trust, the prisoners could not avoid the contrast with the world they had known. Their captivity became less about fences and more about perspective. The origins of their discovery were humble, rooted in farms, factories, and small-town streets. Yet those origins would shape the way they remembered their time in America. What began as routine assignments and camp structures quietly became the foundation for one of the most profound revelations of their lives, that freedom could thrive without chains, and that strength could exist without fear. Although these prisoners were far from the front lines, the impressions they carried reached back into the heart of the war itself. Each man had once fought under the conviction that Germany's authoritarian system was the only path to strength. Their leaders had told them that liberty weakened nations, that only discipline enforced by fear could forge true power. Yet here, in the quiet order of American towns, they witnessed the opposite. The farms thrived, the factories produced relentlessly, and the people lived without chains. America's ability to wage a global war while maintaining such freedom struck the prisoners as both bewildering and undeniable. It revealed that strength could be drawn from trust rather than command. Imagine a soldier who once marched through the streets of Berlin, head bowed beneath banners and the presence of officers. Now, years later, that same soldier stood on American soil watching a town function without a single official shouting orders. The bakery doors opened in the morning, trains ran on time, and children walked to school with books in hand. Nothing collapsed into chaos, no disorder erupted. Instead, life flourished with a confidence that seemed unshakable. For the prisoners, the realization was sharp. The society defeating them in battle did not need the rigid scaffolding of tyranny to survive. This recognition unsettled their understanding of the war. They began to see that the conflict was not only one of weapons and tactics, but of ideas. The battlefield stretched beyond the trenches and deserts into the very question of how societies sustained themselves. If America could remain free and strong at the same time, then perhaps the foundation of their own nation had been built on a false promise. The men did not speak of this openly, for doubts could be dangerous even in captivity. But in their silence, many carried the weight of an uncomfortable truth. The impact was not only philosophical but personal. Guards who treated them with calm authority rather than menace demonstrated another kind of discipline. Farmers who trusted them with tools and tasks showed that respect could achieve more than intimidation. These small encounters accumulated, forming a quiet challenge to the system they had once fought for. The shock was not the cruelty of captivity, but its fairness. In that fairness lay a lesson they could not easily forget. Some prisoners resisted the realization, clinging to the old belief that freedom was a mask, that behind it America hid weaknesses. They told themselves that a society without chains would eventually collapse, that order must be enforced or it would vanish. Yet each day contradicted this hope. The trains still ran, the fields still yielded crops, and the towns remained orderly. The evidence grew heavier, pressing against their denial, leaving cracks in the wall of certainty. For those who allowed themselves to see it, the impact was profound. America's victory on the battlefield was not simply the result of weapons or numbers, but of a culture that believed in its people. The strength of the U.S. Army reflected the strength of the homes and towns behind it, places where liberty was ordinary and trust was the foundation. In this way, the battlefield extended far beyond Europe and the Pacific. It stretched into the daily lives of Americans who lived without fear, and into the eyes of prisoners who witnessed it firsthand. In time, many of these men understood that they were seeing something their own leaders could never have explained to them. The war had revealed more than military weakness. It had revealed the fragility of a system that relied only on control. Across the ocean, in a land they had once considered their enemy, they encountered the startling truth that freedom itself could be a weapon, one more enduring than tanks or rifles. For the German prisoners, that truth was perhaps the most enduring impact of the battlefield. As weeks turned into months, the conversations inside the camps began to reflect the shock of what the prisoners had seen. Men gathered in their barracks at night, whispering in German, comparing memories of their villages back home with the American towns just beyond the fences. Some laughed bitterly at the thought that farmers in the United States trusted them with tools, while in Germany, even loyal citizens were watched suspiciously. Others sat in silence, wrestling with the quiet realization that their homeland's obsession with control had bred only fear. The contrast was too vivid to ignore, and it began to reshape how they thought about their own past. This shift spread slowly but steadily. Groups of prisoners who worked side by side in fields or factories returned each evening with stories that added to the growing pool of evidence. They spoke of shopkeepers who smiled as they passed, guards who treated them with dignity, and towns where people moved freely without permission slips or documents. Each account chipped away at the image of America painted by Nazi propaganda. They had been told that the United States was decadent, disorganized, and weak. Yet before their eyes, they saw a country that thrived on liberty and order in equal measure. The wider consequences reached beyond personal impressions. Captivity became a mirror, forcing the prisoners to confront not only the strength of their enemy, but also the fragility of the system they had once fought for. When one man questioned why life in America felt so different, Another struggled to answer, caught between loyalty to his homeland and the undeniable reality before him. For some, these moments sowed doubt, a quiet seed that would not vanish. For others, it created an inner conflict that gnawed at them long after the war ended. They had been soldiers, proud and certain, but captivity revealed that certainty to be brittle. The consequences also touched morale. Within the camps, men who clung to the old ways grew defensive, sometimes ridiculing those who dared to voice admiration for American life. Yet the evidence was all around them. A farmer's handshake, a guard's calm words, a community that lived without fear. These moments did not fade, they accumulated. Even silence became telling, as prisoners who could not admit the truth aloud nonetheless carried it in their thoughts. The weight of that contrast shaped not only how they saw America, but also how they began to see Germany. For many, the realization was painful. They thought of their families back home living under suspicion, rationing food, obeying rules that seemed endless. They imagined what it would be like if their children could walk to school as freely as American children did, or if their wives could shop without the shadow of officials watching. The knowledge that such freedom existed elsewhere made their own situation feel even more suffocating. In captivity, they discovered that chains were not only physical, but also invisible, binding a nation through fear. That understanding cut deeply, and it left scars that no guard or fence could impose. The wider consequences of this revelation extended beyond the war years. Though the prisoners did not yet know it, the memory of what they had seen would linger when they returned home. Some would bury it, unwilling to face the betrayal of their old beliefs. Others would hold on to it, quietly shaping their views as Germany rebuilt itself after defeat. In either case, the experience had already left its mark. The lessons of American freedom had entered their lives, not through lectures or ideology, but through daily exposure to a society that lived without chains. Thus, captivity became more than confinement. It became a turning point where soldiers who had once believed in the power of fear began to sense the strength of trust. The wider consequences of this discovery rippled outward, touching not only their own identities, but also the larger story of the war. For in these quiet encounters, the prisoners saw what many had never imagined: that liberty was not fragile, but enduring, and that it could transform even the thoughts of men who once fought to destroy it. There came a moment when the prisoners could no longer dismiss what they had seen as coincidence or illusion. At first, some had told themselves that American freedom was a mask, a temporary show meant to confuse them. But as days turned into seasons, the reality proved consistent. The towns remained orderly without patrols. The shops stayed stocked, the schools remained open, and people continued to live without fear. This was no performance staged for the eyes of captives. It was the natural rhythm of a nation that trusted its people. And in that rhythm, the prisoners recognized a truth they could not deny. Imagine standing on the edge of a field, the sun dipping low as the day's work ended. A farmer who had overseen the prisoners tipped his hat and offered a word of thanks, then walked away without suspicion, leaving them under the watch of a single guard. The scene was simple, almost mundane, yet for the German soldier it felt extraordinary. Back home, no citizen would have been trusted in such a way. The sheer normalcy of American life, unfolding with calm confidence, struck harder than any weapon. It was here, in these ordinary moments, that the climax of their realization unfolded. The prisoners began to feel a quiet shift within themselves. They had entered captivity with the belief that liberty bred weakness, that without strict control, chaos would erupt. Yet every day contradicted that belief. They saw order without oppression, strength without fear, unity without forced obedience. It was as if the ground beneath their old convictions crumbled, leaving them unsteady, but unable to ignore the truth. For some, the weight of this realization was liberating. For others, it was crushing, for it revealed that the system they had fought to protect was not strong at all, but hollow. The climax was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by the accumulation of countless small moments that together became undeniable. a child laughing on her way to school, a neighbor greeting another with a wave instead of a salute, a store clerk trusting customers to pay honestly. Each image piled upon the last, until the prisoners could no longer explain them away. The strength of liberty was no longer an abstract idea, but a lived experience, unfolding before their eyes in a way no lecture could have taught. Some resisted until the end, clinging to loyalty as a lifeline, yet even they carried the images with them. The contrast between what they had been told and what they had witnessed was too vivid to vanish. In whispers at night or silent reflections at work, the prisoners confronted the knowledge that they had been misled. The climax of their captivity lay not in battle scars or escapes, but in the collapse of certainty. The iron grip of authoritarianism had promised them strength, but it was here, in the absence of chains, that they finally saw what strength truly was. For the German prisoners, this turning point was as profound as it was unsettling. Their enemy had defeated them on the battlefield, but what struck them most deeply was not the weapons of war, but the quiet endurance of a society built on trust. The climax of their realization was not loud or violent, but silent and steady, echoing in the spaces between what they had believed and what they now knew to be true. In those moments, many of them understood that their worldview had been forever altered, and that no return to their old convictions could erase what they had witnessed. When the war finally ended and the prisoners boarded ships to return to their homeland, they carried with them more than memories of confinement. They carried images of towns without chains, of people who lived without fear, and of a society that found strength not in control but in trust. These impressions were not the lessons of propaganda nor the forced speeches of captors. They were lived experiences etched into the daily rhythm of captivity. For many of the men, the memory of American freedom was the most enduring legacy of their time across the ocean. The return to Germany was often bitter. Cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, and the shadow of suspicion still lingered in daily life. Families struggled to rebuild amid the rubble of a defeated regime, and many former soldiers found it difficult to reconcile what they had seen abroad with what they now faced at home. Yet the contrast was impossible to erase. The openness of American towns, so ordinary to those who lived there, became extraordinary in memory. It served as a silent comparison to the harsh realities of life under authoritarian control. Some prisoners tried to bury these experiences, unwilling to admit that they had once believed a lie. They spoke little of their captivity, focusing instead on survival in post-war Germany. But others allowed the memories to shape them, quietly influencing how they thought about politics, society, and their nation's future. For these men, the lesson was clear. They had seen that freedom did not destroy order, but strengthened it. They had seen that trust could unite a community more firmly than fear ever could. The legacy of these encounters was subtle, but its power lay in its persistence. It lived on in conversations years later, in the recollections of men who could still remember the sight of children walking to school without fear, or neighbors greeting each other without suspicion. These images did not fade with time. They remained as reminders that another way of life was possible, even in a world scarred by war. The prisoners had been enemies of America, yet in captivity they became witnesses to its most enduring strength. As Germany rebuilt itself, some of those who had been prisoners carried these impressions into the fabric of their new lives. They became quiet testaments to the idea that liberty could endure even after destruction. The memory of towns without chains was not only a story of wartime captivity, but also a seed planted in the minds of men who would one day live in a freer nation. The strength of democracy, they realized, was not fragile. It was resilient, capable of surviving war, and capable of inspiring even those who had once fought against it. In the end, the legacy of these German prisoners was not measured in battles won or lost, but in the quiet transformation of their beliefs. They had set out as soldiers of a regime that prized control above all else, but they returned as witnesses to another truth. The freedom they observed in American towns remained with them, shaping how they remembered the war and how they imagined the future. It was a legacy born not of victory or defeat, but of revelation. And in that revelation, liberty had spoken louder than chains ever could.